So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for the book launch for Professor Bob Sutter. This book is U.S.-China Relations, Perilous Past, Uncertain Future, and this book launch is for the 4th edition. My name is Adam Bubinich, and I am the Program Coordinator for the East Asia National Resource Center. And I'm just going to say a few words about the Seeger Center and the NRC and our esteemed speakers before we get started. The Seeger Center for Asian Studies is a university research institute and the academic home of the Asian Studies program of the Elliott School for International Affairs at the George Washington University. Its mission is to increase the quality and broaden the scope of scholarly research and publication on Asia, promote U.S.-Asia scholarly interaction, and educate a new generation of scholars, students, analysts, and policymakers. The Seeger Center promotes research and policy analysis on East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia through an active program of publishing, teaching, public events, and policy engagement. In 2018, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and the Institute for Korean Studies had the esteemed honor of being deemed a Title VI National Resource Center. The East Asia National Resource Center at the George Washington University is supported by the Title VI provision of the 1965 Higher Education. The NRC aims to enhance GW's ability to engage the broader public community, including students, K-12 educators, minority-serving institutions, policymakers, and the general public on the issues of importance in East Asia. Its mission is to provide learning resources on East Asia that empowers educators and future leaders to better engage on contemporary global issues. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our esteemed speakers. So first, I'm going to introduce Professor Bob Sutter, who is the man of the hour of this event. So Robert Sutter is a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University since 2011. He's also served as the director of the school's main undergraduate program involving over 2,000 students. His earlier full-time position was as visiting professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. He is a PhD graduate in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University. Sutter has published over 22 books, 4 with multiple editions, such as the book we're going to be talking about today, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relations with the United States. Sutter's government career, spanning from 1968 to 2001, saw service as a senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia, and the Pacific at the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council, the China Division at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Our moderator today is Professor John W. Tai. John W. Tai, PhD, is a professorial lecturer at the East Asia School of Elliott School, of International Affairs, George Washington University. He is also an instructor at the Foreign Service Institute of the U.S. Department of State and a senior language analyst at Lagos, providing support for the U.S. government. He is a specialist on China's political developments, science and technology developments, and foreign relations. He also specializes in Taiwan's internal developments and external relations and teaches a graduate seminar on this subject at the Elliott School. He's the author of various articles and commentaries on Chinese and Taiwan politics and foreign relations, including the book Building Civil Society and Authoritarian China, 2015. But before they speak, we're going to hear some opening remarks from our esteemed Dean, Alyssa Ayres. Alyssa Ayres was appointed Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs and a professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University, effective February 1st, 2021. Dean Ayres is a foreign policy practitioner, an award-winning author with senior experience in government, nonprofit, and private sectors. She has a very long career, and I'm just going to give a short summary for the sake of time. From 2013 to 2021, She was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, where she remains an adjunct senior fellow. Ayers has been awarded numerous fellowships and has received 4 group or individual superior honor awards for her work at the State Department, where she served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. She speaks Hindi, Urdu, and in the mid-1990s, she worked as an interpreter for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She received an AB from Harvard College and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the Halifax International Security Forum's Agenda Working Group, and a member of the Women's Foreign Policy Group Board of Directors. Everyone, please give your a round of applause for Dean Harris.
Adam, for that kind introduction. We're so happy to be able to launch Professor Sutter's latest edition of his book here today. As you heard, my name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm dean of the Elliott School, and I really am so happy to see our in-person group here. And I know we have a number of people online. How many do we have online? We have 71. It's a pretty big group online, so we'll try to make this as interactive and as inclusive as possible. We're happy to be able to convene today to discuss one of the most important geopolitical relationships of our time, and that is the relationship between the United States and China, something that Professor Sutter has been studying for more than 4 decades. We're celebrating his newest book, U.S.-China Relations, Perilous Past, Uncertain Present. It's the extensively revised 4th edition of this book, which was first published about a decade ago by Roman. So in this edition, Professor Sutter is focused on the changes in U.S. foreign policy toward China that have occurred over the last 5 years, noting how the United States has increasingly turned against Chinese government practices, seen here as very detrimental to important U.S. interests. This is a shift, and this shift represents a fundamental change from previous American policy, seeking an ever closer engagement with the Chinese government, with Chinese people, with Chinese society. That policy of engagement had been in place for 40 years. So this process of change and the changing U.S. approach has been disruptive and risky. China's government shows little sign of compromise on the various issues in dispute. China has changed its approach. So we'll hear more about that, and we will hear Professor Sutter's thoughts on what might come from increasing tensions in U.S.-China relations. Of course, this all remains uncertain. Now, why has the U.S. government carried out this change? Our own distinguished George Washington University alumnus, Senator Mark Warner, has captured what is an unusual bipartisan consensus, a consensus among Democrat and Republican majorities in Congress about the essential need for the United States to take steps now to deal with very serious challenges from China. Senator Warner has warned that America faces a new Sputnik moment, requiring large-scale efforts to defend the United States and its interests in the face of unchecked negative behavior from the Chinese government. Senator Warner is a very well-informed veteran leader of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He has experience as a successful technology executive, dealt extensively with China prior to his political career. So Senator Warner himself, in this new period of policy transition, has reversed his past emphasis on ever closer engagement with China. Now, to help us understand the role of Congress among important determinants in what is now a U.S. hardening towards China, Professor Sutter will discuss the major revision of his book on U.S.-China relations. We'll also hear about recent events with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how this has underscored this changed U.S. posture, as American policymakers have observed China's continued support for Russia's brutal armed attacks on Ukrainian civilians and combatants in pursuit of Russian expansionism. Professor Sutter will explain the 3 fundamental challenges Chinese behavior poses for the United States, demonstrating why this new turn in U.S. foreign policy will endure. He will also discuss gaps in existing U.S. strategy to counter China's challenges. So we look forward to hearing from Professor Sutter on his new book. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. I know I will. Again, this is his new book, U.S.-China Relations, Perilous Past, Uncertain Present. Over to you, Professor Sutter. Thank you.
thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, Dean Ayers, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dr. Time, for spending time and moderating today. My purpose today is really to deal with three questions, things that are very important to me, and I think they're very important to anyone interested in U.S.-China relations. And the first one is this rivalry that the United States has with China. We need to understand it better, it seems to be, and I'm going to try to help in this regard. And my sense is that this is going to endure. It's not something that's going away. In fact, I've never seen anything like this in my whole career, except for the change with Nixon and now that took hold in the United States. So just some overview points here is the key driver in this effort on the part of the United States to change its policy is this remarkable bipartisan congressional cohesion driving this force. I've spent the last 4.5 years looking at this in Washington. And people outside of Washington get tired of Americans in Washington telling them, this is where it really happened. Well, folks, in this case, this is where it really happened. And I'm trying to make sure people understand that a little bit better. Congress exerts extraordinary influence over China policy today. If you look at the history of U.S.-China policy, you'll see that this is the most important period where Congress has exerted influence on China policy. I know you probably see this in other instances, but this one is lasting. And Congress is leading as well as following in this case. And so this is very important in that regard. The waves of anti-China legislation you see today have been developing for over 4 years. The remarkable negative shift in American policy against the Chinese government behavior now dominates U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific, U.S. policy on high technology with China, and many other important areas. This is a high stakes game. This is a high stakes contest. This is for real. And it means the leadership of the world. This is a very important dimension. And it's seen this way in Congress. These majorities in Congress are very concerned about all of this. And so congressional attitudes really make up the core of the so-called Washington consensus, moving America in an ever more hardening direction dealing with China. This consensus emerged inside the Beltway in 2017, but it really emerged in strength in 2018. Congress playing a very big leadership role. And going forward, the signs are obvious that congressional resolve to counter China provides the basis for projecting that the recent hardening we've seen will continue to be the U.S. approach going forward. And that's an overview of the situation. So let's look at some of the details, which I think can help us understand this better. The change in policy from the United States point of view dealing with China began really in 2017, in December of 2017, with the Trump administration's strategy, national security strategy. And then there was a national defense strategy that followed that. This document read just like something I read when I first started working in the government in the Cold War. This is a very Cold War document. And it said China is the #1 danger to the United States. No ifs, ands, and buts. China is the #1 danger. China has never been seen as the #1 danger to the United States. Never before. Now it is. The Soviet Union was always the #1 danger. Never China. China was a danger. The Soviet Union was the overwhelming danger. Now it's the. Now that's what the Trump people said. That isn't what Donald Trump said. And you're all aware of that. He was pretty erratic in how he dealt with these things. And most people, most media and so forth, didn't pay much attention to this strategy. But in Congress, they saw this and they said, yes, this is what we've been concerned about for a long time. This is what needs action. This is where the Mark Warners of this world saw this and said, yes, this is what we need. And so what you find is that Congress glommed on to this sort of thing, if that's a proper word to use in a forum, but they glommed on to this, and they have driven it ever since. And what you find is that the shift in the administration was erratic. The Trump people disagreed on trade policy and economic issues. And Donald Trump, he was just, you know, he has many qualities, I guess, but the point is that he was erratic in this regard. He was constantly talking about Xi Jinping as his friend. You know, he went back and forth with this sort of thing. And so the result is that you needed some continuity, you needed some consistency in this regard. And this is where the bipartisan majorities in Congress come into play. And by the middle of 2018, they set up a US policy focused on a whole of government American effort to deal with the various challenges of China. And you say, well, what are those challenges? We'll deal with those in a minute. That's probably the most important thing I'm going to say today, are those challenges, so that you understand that. And so the Trump administration's punitive tariffs and restrictions on high technology sales to China resulted in the trade war. And but that led to a truce in December of 2018. And that lasted for a year or so. And then we finally had a deal, the first phase trade deal in January of 2020. And this negative shift in the United States policy was not well understood by public opinion. Public opinion didn't agree with this. Public opinion didn't think China was the main danger. They would say, well, aren't we supposed to engage with China? What are you talking about? They didn't understand this at all. Business didn't like this at all either. The main business interests in the United States. And the media, the mainstream media didn't understand this. They focused on Trump's antics. Trump was a protectionist. Trump was something else. The strategy eluded them. Let's look at the Democratic presidential candidates. They were running for office in 2019. What were they saying about China? Almost nothing. They were asked at the end of interviews, what about China? Oh, yeah, well, we don't like human rights in China. Okay, that's fine. And that was about it. And that included a guy named Joseph Biden. And when he was asked about China in those days, he said this, what are you talking about? We're not worried about China. We're much more powerful than China. Why should we worry about China? He said that. Jake Sullivan, you know who he is? He's the national security advisor of Mr. Biden. He was asked about this issue in 2019. He said, if public opinion doesn't care about China, we shouldn't be caring about China. That was his view then. So this is the country. This is the country. So it's in Washington. This thing is developing in Washington, and it's starting to spread, but it doesn't spread very fast, and it meets a lot of challenges. But Congress doesn't give up. They don't stop. They keep going. And by 2020, with COVID hitting the United States and having this tremendous impact on US public opinion, and then Mr. Trump shifting to a very harsh policy toward China, and then Joseph Biden being attacked by Trump has to shift his policy very quickly too, you find an emerging consensus inside the United States that's very tough toward China, and the media gets this as well. And so that's where we are now. That's been developing that's the developments under the Trump administration. And then let's take a look at Mr. Biden. He comes into office, Biden comes into office, and he's presented by Mr. Trump's people with a whole array of initiatives that they've taken to really restrict any positive movement in relation to China. Very successfully done. But the Congress has 300 pieces of legislation at the end of that Congress, the previous in 2020, that are hostile to China. And so they no longer are relevant, but they're brought over into the new year. And what happens to Mr. Biden? This is I don't know the reason what happens. Mr. Biden does a total change. And by March of 2021, he's talking just like the congressional majorities in Congress. This is the fourth industrial revolution. China's leading the fourth industrial revolution. And if they do, we are in real trouble. That was his message. He got it. That's what the Congress was saying. And that he got it, and he's been very consistent ever since. Sullivan's been very consistent ever since, and Blinken has been very consistent ever since. Why that happened, I don't know. That happened, and I think they mean it. And so this is I think it's the influence of Congress. And so anyway, we find then that they undertake, the Biden they undertake a much more methodical, much more step-by-step and actually a much more substantial counter to Chinese challenges in a whole range of ways. And they hold off in talks to the Chinese. They don't talk to them. They talk to all the allies and partners. The strategy is basically build the allies and partners so that you can have a strong united front to deal with China. And they work on that, and it works pretty effectively. And so under these circumstances, what you find is that Biden and Xi do have an interaction in November of last year, and Biden is trying to keep the relationship from leading to conflict and war and so forth. But it really doesn't change the overall situation. Of course, the administration continues these tough policies toward China. They boycott the Olympics. They attack the Chinese on various things. They restrict trade and investment and so forth. And the Congress is doing its thing, passing all sorts of legislation. And the National Defense Authorization Act of that fall is full of China, anti-China things, just like the one in 2018, starting this process of the whole government pushback against China. And then we have the situation of the war in Ukraine. And the only thing I can say about that definitively, that has deepened antagonism toward China in Washington, Congress, and elsewhere. And so this is this just deepens the situation as far as I'm concerned. So what are the challenges posed by China? Why are they so serious? I think, if anything, I'd like you to remember this from my talk, if you would. Over the past 4 years, U.S. government decision makers in the administration and among bipartisan majorities in Congress have shown ever clearer awareness of the challenges posed by China to the interests of the United States and the open world order that it supports. First is the challenge posed by the over 3 decades of rapid development of Chinese military power, tipping the balance in the Indo-Pacific, supporting Chinese territorial expansionism, and undermining U.S. alliances and partnerships and seeking dominance in Asia. The second, and this is the most important, is the challenge posed by China's similarly long-standing efforts using state-directed, I have to read this because it's a little complicated, using state-directed development policies to plunder foreign intellectual property rights and undermine international competitors, having increasingly profound negative impact on the U.S. and Western interests. Beijing does so with hidden and overt state-directed economic coercion, egregious government subsidies, import protection, and export promotion using highly protected and state-supported products to weaken and often destroy foreign competition in key industries. In this way, it recently seeks dominance in the world at major world high technology industries and related military power to displace the United States and secure China's primacy in Asia and world leadership. And the third area is a challenge of global governance. More than any other power, Beijing leverages economic dependence, influence operations, including elite capture and control of important infrastructure to compel deference to its preferences. And in the Indo-Pacific region, these practices are backed by intimidating Chinese security and military power. What are China's preferences? They want to legitimate the above predatory Chinese economic practices and territorial expansion. They want to oppose efforts to promote accountable governance, human rights, and democracy. They oppose U.S. alliances seen impeding China's rise. And they support the forceful foreign advances of Vladimir Putin's Russia and the rule of other authoritarian and often corrupt world leaders unaccountable to their citizens. Since 2018, 2 challenges are often seen as particularly dangerous, existential threats to fundamental American national security and well-being. The first is the Chinese effort to undermine U.S. power and influence in and dominate Asia. The second is the Chinese effort to seek dominance in the high technology industries of the future. Such dominance will make America subservient to Chinese economic power. And because such technology is essential to modern national security, subservient to Chinese military power. Seeking to avoid Chinese dominance appears to remain a strong overall driver of the efforts of bipartisan majorities in Congress and administration partners to defend America against China's challenges. They don't want to be dominated. That's the common thought. Okay, what's the outlook? Well, the outlook here, obviously, Xi Jinping is not changing his policy. He has not compromised. He's determined to continue this path. It's incremental. It's not as provocative as Putin, but boy, he's doing the challenge. He's doing all those things I just mentioned. And they do it very carefully, very cleverly in many cases. They disguise it. You don't know what's happening sometimes, but it happens all the time. And he continues without compromise these multifaceted challenges. The legislation pending in Congress demonstrates that Congress is determined to continue a hard line against this. But what you find is that Congress is not very skillful. They're crude. Isn't it crude? You know, Congress is often seen as very crude. And the legislation just targets several things and it sort of pounces on them. That's it. And so they're trying to defend America, but they're not good at making a strategy. So what America needs is a good strategy. But we can't do it yet. We haven't been able to do it effectively. And so the Congress is still at it. You know, they say, we're going to protect, we're doing what we can to protect America. But what about the strategy? Well, to do that, you have to bring together America to deal with this issue. And what you find is divisions. And who are the divisive forces here? Well, one is business. Lots of business are making lots of money in China. And the Chinese know this. They love it. The Chinese authorities know this. This is leverage for them. It's wonderful. And these folks want to make profits and their companies make money. And it works for a good long time sometimes. Sometimes they're short. Sometimes you get just undermined by the Chinese. And that will often happen. But often it's lucrative. And it's a good place for people to put my retirement funds. And then, so I'm part of this problem, you know. I mean, I can't get them to stop. And so you have this because you get a good return. Well, those folks don't want a tough policy for China. They want more moderation. China isn't 10 feet tall. Don't exaggerate the danger from China. That's what is said by many people in that group. Second group is universities. Universities work very closely with China on research and development and these sorts of things, and they want to be able to continue this. This is a way to innovate. This is the way for progress. This is just like the companies. They want to do this sort of thing. And so well, wait a minute, if we really do this kind of thing, we're going to lose out on these connections. And this is wrong. We shouldn't do that. So they oppose that. And the third are a lot of China specialists. I think I'm a minority among China specialists. I've been doing this a long time, but I think I'm a minority. I'm an evidence-based analyst. I don't get really excited about things. I look at the data, I try to come to conclusions as a result of the data. 5 years ago, I wasn't like this at all. I'm not an ideologue or anything like that. I just say, wow, I look at the evidence. I'm like Mark Warner. I look at the evidence and wow, it used to be engagement was in our interest. Now it sure isn't. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so, but the point is, China specialists are really invested in this. And they have a view. And I'm giving a crude argument. They like nuance. Academics like nuance. They go, oh, show me a pattern here. And I'm not showing you a pattern. I'm showing you a challenge, challenges. And the opposite side is a bunch of sluggers that are trying to pound it somehow or to counter it. And it's not artful at all. So to write a good academic paper like that, it looks really crude. You see? So you need to understand that. And maybe there's a prejudice against it. I don't know. But a lot of artful things are being written by specialists on China. And they don't defend America enough. I'm much more focused on defending America, not having a good China policy. How do we defend America in this situation? And I'm with Mark Warner on that one. think we have to do something with that. We need a strategy to do it. So these are things that, but these are not easily overcome. And so Mr. Biden is trying to come up with a strategy. It looks like it's in the works. It might be something coming up soon. That'll be great if that happens. But I'm not sure what it's going to look like. And meanwhile, Biden is trying to do this, and this is another gap. So these are gaps in America's ability to deal effectively with China that I'm laying out here. There's another gap. And that is the gap of continuity. He's relying on allies and partners. These allies and partners, they have the same kind of constituencies that we do. They have business interests, they have university interests, and others that don't want to have a tough policy toward China. They have to deal with that too. And so Biden's telling them, look, this policy is for real. It's going to stay. This is going to be American policy. And they say, well, we remember Donald Trump, and he kept moving around. And he did things we didn't like anyway. He didn't like allies very much, for example. And so they say, well, Biden, we like you. You like allies. Great. This is great. But your approval rating is less than 40%. How do you think you're going to get elected that way? And who's in the wings? Who's in the wings? You know who is in the wings. And they know who. And so the point is, are they going to really align closely with the United States and then have Mr. Trump come in and bash them about one thing and another as an ally and partner? So he can't establish that easily. So we're in that kind of a pickle where, okay, so the conclusion of my remarks are this, is that we're going forward with this policy. It's going to be tough. Congress is going to ensure that it's going to be tough. And more is coming, I'm sure. They've got all sorts of things that they're cooking up here. And they'll be countering these particular challenges, the military challenge, the economic challenge, and the governance challenge. And don't expect it all to be in one piece and look very nice to the vote. It's not. It's just going to be a lot of pieces. And so that will continue. And that's why I think the rivalry will continue to endure in this situation. Will it be effective? A more unified strategy would help. And there's apparently going to be one, but whether that gets support and whether that proves to be lasting, those are unknowns at this point. So that's my remarks to you today. Thank you for listening. This is gloomy. It's crude and gloomy. I apologize for that, but I think it's real. And understanding why this happens in this city and why it happens in our country, but I think the role of Congress is just absolutely essential. And that's going to continue. So thank you very much. And hopefully, maybe, well, I'm not going to be naive and say this is going to all work out. I don't think it's going to all work out. I think we're in a very long struggle. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, so part of my job here is to moderate questions. But before then, so for those online, I think I have a tablet here, and then you can start putting your questions in so that I can go through them and select them as appropriate. But before that, part of my job also is to provide a comments now about Bob's book. I think one of the things that stands out for me, and just as a, I don't know if you call it disclaimer here, but Bob was one of my first grad teacher. I was one of his grad students here at the Elliott School. And so it's kind of hard for me to refer to him as Bob. It's always Professor Sutter to me. So this is something that I'm getting used to a little bit here, trying to get used to. But I think one of the things with a book like this, oftentimes we read them, and there are many very good books here. But I think a big part of what's valuable about this book is, let's face it, it's written by Bob Sutter. Someone who has, for all these years, basically spanned the academic world, the policy analysis world, and he has, as the bio that Adam has shared, was there at the very top of the policy analysis world. And so he brings with him the kind of experiences and background that very, very few China specialists. Bob, I think in his comment tries to distinguish himself from the China specialist. He is a China specialist. Maybe he doesn't like to admit to that, but I think he brings a unique background, and that brings the evidence. And I think in many ways, this is the one special thing about this particular book, which is the 4th edition. And also, as he mentioned, this is a very timely book because I think he alluded to it. I call it what we're experiencing right now, what we're witnessing right now, is a once in a generational shift in terms of our perspective on time. For a long, long time, we were looking at China very differently. Now we're looking at China completely different, in a different way. It's put in the book, Hardening. It's hardening, and it's a bipartisan consensus. And so in many ways, and he brings a lot of the challenges, as he mentioned in his comments, and certainly goes into further details in the book about all the challenges and all the drivers and determinants that ultimately lead to where we are what we are today. And I think that's the kind of value that we need. And in many ways, I can recommend not just the 4th edition. It might be worthwhile to recommend the entire series, all the way going back to decades ago, first, second, third, and fourth generation edition. That will give you a full and comprehensive perspective from a leading expert in terms of how we're looking at China, how we're looking at the bilateral relationship. And one of the things that to me also hits as I was reading, going through Bob's book, is it really does in many ways. It's kind of like reading the book is almost like giving a context to my career. A lot of the things that he has put in there, sort of I've experienced it. I still remember. About 10 years ago, I was living in China, working and doing my dissertation research from 2007 to 2011. That was the tail end of the Hu Jintao administration. Some would say that was sort of, everybody was looking at the Hu Jintao at that point in China. China seems to be liberalizing, it seems to be going away. I was doing my research on civil society in China, which actually you could talk to people and people were willing to talk to you about it. Can't do the same research, of course. I'm not so sure what you can say about civil society today. My findings were very simple. I was looking at particular organizations. I was looking at things, in terms of their relationship, what relationship with the organization would drive their success and so on and so forth. And obviously, even back then, the state's perspective, the importance of that political connection was very important. Regrettably, years later today, a good friend of mine who's in China, he's in the Chinese academic community, he comes back to me and says, actually, your finding is even more salient today because the government, the party, is that much more important than ever before. And so in many ways, there is that aspect of the timeliness. There are other things that I think is very important. This is a book about US-China relations, but this has a lot of implications, in my opinion, for American foreign policy. I think a lot of the conventional wisdom, if you look at the surface, is that foreign policy is the realm of the executive branch. This is where it's run by the White House, it's run by the State Department. Congress supposedly would have little role except to declare war and all that other things. But I think if you look at the China policy making in the United States, certainly Congress has played a very, very influential role. And this is something that you can probably track all the way back, as Bob mentions in his book, to the Cold War era. But certainly now more so than ever, it's really exerting even greater influence. Earlier in my career, I worked as a staff on China-related matters for the Congressional Commission on International Religious Freedom. So in many ways, I saw that even back then, the commission itself was very hard-hitting on China. But we were surrounded in a context where everybody was still for the engagement perspective, right? And certainly the executive branch, we would write these annual reports and basically providing recommendations to both the Congress and the executive branch, many ways telling the executive branch what they're not doing or what they're not doing properly. I'm sure the executive branch was not at all happy, or they were found us as much an heretic as many other places. But we see a very different thing. And Congress, again, one of the things that Bob's book mentions is Congress has remained very consistent in that sense. It's the constant throughout all of these things, and even much more so than ever before. And so that's another thing that, that really, as I was thinking, if you think about this book, is goes beyond just U.S. China, looking at ourselves, because a lot of the things when we talk about China policy, and this I think comes through in the book as well, is that the domestic politics is very key. We oftentimes think of foreign policy, especially if you're dealing with realist theories. We always think about states are just kind of these, like the international system is like a billiard table, right? The states are like billiard balls. And they basically are driven by some kind of a physical dynamic that just a momentum that just drives everybody else. But the reality is, if you look within, a lot of the foreign policy, a lot of the international issues are driven by domestic political considerations, domestic political factors. And the China policy making has always been sort of even more so today, and as Bob detailed in this book. And so, those are the things that really, I think, makes this book really that valuable. It provides such a comprehensive view. It gets up to date. But one of the things about it is, another thing about the book that I really I think would be very interesting is that it remains focused, also retains the past editions in terms of the long-term drivers, the long-term determinants. The historical factors have not been determined. And I'm a political scientist by training, but frankly, my first love is history. And I taught history, and I very enjoyed history. And I think that's the part that's sort of the long-term determinants in terms of looking at where we are today. There are these long-term factors that continue to drive us, these legacies that come on. And you can see that in this book, is that looking from, and I think this is where the benefit is, as Bob talks about, is the evidence-based analyst. So he is not influenced by necessarily particular theoretical influences or approaches and things. He's looking at what's there. And what's there also means that you have to look at the range of factors over time. And I think this is, again, a really another key contribution, I think, this book that really shapes, helps us to understand both student, educated lay readers, experts. And I think those are the kind of things that are very, very interesting. All these determinants, both contemporary, both current, as well as long-term drivers. Now, one of the things before I go into talking about people, raising questions, is, I guess as a moderator, I do get to ask the first question. So that's my privilege.
Maybe more.
Or maybe ask more questions. But I already see that questions are coming in through online, and so there are probably other questions. So, and I think if someone can tell me, like, how long do we have in terms of the Q&A? 1:15. We've got all the way to 1:15. Okay. All right. So let me just ask the first question. To sort of follow up on that last comment I made about the long-term drivers. And so I would definitely ask Bob here is, what do you, of all the drivers and all the factors that you discussed, and I think in many ways, we oftentimes, it's very easy for us to focus on the contemporary or the immediate drivers. And in your book, certainly you provide that long. So if someone were to ask you, if I'm asking you, what would you identify as some long-term factors, long-term view that you see in terms of legacy that continue to impact what we're seeing in terms of U.S.-China relations today and going forward?
Well, thanks. It's a great question. The American side is confused. It's a very pluralistic society. You have lots of different interests that show themselves at different times. And so the Americans have a lot of differences with the Chinese system. The governance system of China is a fundamental issue in that respect. I guess I do see more continuity on the Chinese side, and let me just explain that. And when I worked for Congress, I would occasionally get a trip to China, and I would get a paid trip. So I'd be, and this one trip was very enjoyable, very good access. And so it was just me. For several days, I was in Asia for other business, but then I was able to get these access. And I got access, this was in 1995, at the end of 1995. The Taiwan Straits crisis was underway. The live fire exercises. And I got to have a meeting with Mr. Xiong Wang Kai, who is the chief intelligence officer of China. But in conjunction with that, they set me up with a meeting with 7 retired Chinese strategists, foreign ministry people, and intelligence operation, I assume, intelligence people. And I was discussing things with them, and it wasn't going well because they knew I worked for Congress, and they were sort of, the expression is they were beating me up so that I would go back to Congress and tell them how upset China was. And that was the cynical view of it. But they were doing a good job of it. And so there was a pause in the meeting, and then one guy just gets up and he says to himself, he says to us, he says, "You Americans, you want to be the leading power in the world. You want to be the leading power of the Asia Pacific region. You want to continue support for Taiwan, and you want to change our political system. 7 of those, 1 of me. So what do I do? I'm very courageous. I shut up. I didn't say anything. And he sensed that, and he went on. You're dreaming if you think we'll accept that. We will wait you out. So I've been waiting ever since. And here it is. And we're getting it now. I mean, they don't want the US to be the leading power of the world. It's bad news for China. They certainly don't want the US to be the leading power in the Asia Pacific region. That's been continuous since Mao Zedong. And they don't want the US to support Taiwan. That's no news to anybody, right? And they don't want the US to change their political system. That's fundamental to them. That's continuity. Those things have been there for a long, long time. Sometimes they don't talk about them, sometimes they do, but these are the fundamental ones. And so there we are. We're still at it. These are still the areas of friction. And so from the Chinese side. And I think it's changed over time, one way or another, but these are so it captures it. You can obviously see it had a big impact on me. I remember things like this. And so I thought I was going to I didn't take up a beat, but nonetheless, it was very interesting.
All right, so what we're going to do is try to alternate, if I can, between those live audience questions and also online questions. So when you do raise your questions, please also provide your name and affiliation. So I'm going to go ahead right now with the online, and then we'll try to alternate. Those of you who are here in person, please raise your hands so I can give you out. But one of the questions I think here is, we talk about the hardening. So a lot of it is focused on the negative side of the relationship. We're moving down to this conflict, this confrontation. So one of the things that comes up, and this is kind of picking off one of the questions, is about the environment, right? Global environmental protection. And that's been something that both the current administration has been saying that this might be areas where we can work together with global governance, right? What do you see in terms of possible bilateral dealings in areas like this, as the context of the current hardening of position being more from the United States being more confrontational and the Chinese obviously being much more assertive? How do you see this kind of cooperation on these issues? I mean, is it possible? How is it going to work out going forward?
That's a very good question. What Americans have to watch out for, of course, is that the Chinese will see an Americans wanting this to progress in a certain way, and then use that as leverage to get something that they want. Like they're doing a favor. So I think the best way to handle this is to say, yes, the Chinese are going to move forward based on their own plans. This is defined by their own interest in doing environmental issues. They're doing that. And we can cooperate with China in those ways, because we'll do it too, and we'll reinforce one another. But the idea that the Chinese will do more because you have a good relationship with China, I think is mistaken. I think these are things that they're very focused on their interests and their cost benefit analysis that they do. And so this was a real problem in the Obama years, because why didn't that administration take a stronger stance on the South China Sea? It was so obvious that the Chinese were expanding in the South China Sea, and they didn't make a big deal out of it. And I remember once complaining to one of the administrators. By the way, I'm a Democrat. I've never voted for a Republican in my life. But the point is, and I loved Obama. I loved his rebalance policy in so many ways. But I said, God, why don't you do something about this? And he said, do you want to jeopardize you want to make the relationship hostage to this sort of South China Sea issue? You want to jeopardize that relationship? And the environment was a big part of that. We don't want to jeopardize cooperation in the environment. So therefore, you didn't stand up to that. So now you have a much bigger challenge for not doing that. But that's a different situation. So yes, I think you can have these kinds of. I think we need to be just clear-eyed about it. And I do think government officials today are very clear-eyed about this. I think Blinken and Sullivan, they understand this. They just say, we're not going to let them leverage us on this issue. We'll cooperate where we can. And John Kerry, he still wants he really wants that climate. And so maybe he would be prepared to do it, but I don't think that he has that clout. So I think Mr. Biden seems to agree with what Blinken and Sullivan are saying.
Bob, I wonder if you can give us what you see as perhaps the top 3 issues that you think are driving this hardening. Because there are so many issues, if you think about it. There are issues of the rules-based order and arenas where China is not following what has been the rules of the rules-based order. There are issues of corporate espionage. There are issues that we would put in the sharp power basket. There are the territorial sovereignty issues, right? You just mentioned South China Sea. We've seen the last 3 years, the issue of the border with India has become a hot border. So this spans the kind of traditional conflict issues as well as the kind of new economic conflict issues. You referenced the tech issues as well. How would you kind of rank let's say, the top 3 most intensive factors in this new hardening?
Well, I think the two ones that I pointed to in the talk, the first one, the top one, is high technology industries. If they dominate that, they will dominate. The U.S. is a leader in high technology industries. So one needs to remember that. We don't produce enough steel anymore, things like that, but we're really good at this. And we could be overtaken by China with their approach and how they go about this very high state-directed emphasis. Using the MO that they used in creating these companies that have dominated markets in the world. And so Huawei is an excellent example of how it works. And so this is something that is very dangerous from an economic point of view. But if they dominate that, they will dominate. Since militaries need the high technology, they will dominate. That's key. That's absolutely essential. And when Biden says we got to win that 4th industrial revolution, that's what he's talking about. When Warner says the Sputnik moment, that's what he's talking about. That. And then behind this, of course, is the dominance in Asia. And if they dominate, and a lot of people look at that, it's primacy. The Americans want the primacy in Asia. No, I don't think that's it. The issue is you don't want China to dominate Asia. The hostile power, or could be easily a hostile power. And if they do that, it's like having a hostile power dominate Western Europe. That type of calculation has been prevailing since Imperial Japan. And so the idea is you can't let that, you can let it happen, and then you'll be in a very bad situation trying to defend the Western Hemisphere against this sort of situation. You better do it out there rather than back here. And so those are the 2 key ones. But Alyssa, we still are finding more and more areas. We are a very porous society. The Chinese system, the Chinese government party state system is very good at manipulating that kind of a system. Now, the latest disclosure that we found is that the Chinese businesses are going along with Chinese diplomats and buying islands in strategic locations. And this has the support of the Chinese government. Some of you, you probably don't follow this, but this is the Solomon Islands. This is the latest episode. It's a remarkable thing to see. And what it is that these business people went in, they had a contract for an island. They were going to take it over and build wharves and berths and so forth. And then that was turned down, but now the Solomon Prime Minister is moving again with China. And that same business firm is there. And this pattern has been followed in other parts of the world. So past disclosures have dealt with elite capture, infiltrations in universities, all sorts of issues. This is a new one. And we're still finding these things. So what we need to understand is that, my God, they penetrate these places. They penetrate us. And I'm not talking about Chinese people, Chinese citizens. I'm talking about the Chinese party state. Like those guys I was talking to, 7 guys I was talking to several years ago. This is a Leninist type of system. And they're able to do this. And they do it. What else they do? Well, we'll find out some more. But the disclosures over the last 6-7 years have been remarkable to show how they're able to penetrate a society like ours, and there's so many others in the world. And the problem is that we're in the way of their ambitions. We're in the way. It's not that they see us as an enemy, or, that type. It's more they want to rise and they want to do it their way. And we are definitely in the way. So they want to weaken that, work around it somehow. So lots of challenges. I'm sorry. It's not one. It depends on the circumstance and which one we're dealing with today.
All right, let's go to one online then. So I have a question here. Is you mentioned in your talk about Ukraine? Okay, that's the topic that's been on every headline practically lately. So, and can you speak to the question? Is what do you think are the implications of this seemingly strengthened China-Russia relationship, and what kind of effect or implication does it have for bilateral relationship between U.S. and China, especially in the content of the current administration's focus on this more ideological democracy versus autocracy, especially given just how the Summit for Democracy is likely to come some more. So what do you think are some of the implications and things that we should be looking at?
Yeah, their implications are profound. But the point is that this was profound a long time ago. The Russians and the Chinese really built a very close relationship under Xi Jinping and Putin. It began as soon as Xi Jinping took office. And they have built this very close relationship. And they work on a variety of issues. They work for their respective interests. But one thing, if you examine it closely, one thing you find is that almost every one of these things they work on undermines U.S. power, undermines U.S. power. And so that's part of what they're doing. And they've been doing this for years. And they were doing it in the past because they had common interests and they had common ambitions, and because they had a common view that the United States and the West was weak. And they could do this, and opportunistically. And China did it in the South China Sea. Good example. Just go in and build those islands, and what did the U.S. do? Crimea. Putin was much more aggressive in that regard. What did they do? No big consequences. And so the upshot of all of this is that, that they have been working together closely for a long time. So the best, I think that one of the things that you can say about Ukraine is that now we realize it. Now we say, yes, this is the case. Now, I'm just giving you a little study group, a little advertisement here for the study group I was working with. I was leading this actually. And there were 120 specialists on Russia-China relations for the National Bureau of Asian Research. And we came up with the same basic judgment of the strategy of the Trump administration. And when we were briefing the White House in 2017, late 2017, the White House staff about this project, I noticed that they didn't object to what we were saying, that we have to cooperate together for a long-term difficulty of building ourselves up and building our sources of influence so that we can contest and challenge and stop this behavior of Russia and China. And they didn't blink an eye when we said that. I said, wow, this is interesting. And then two months later, we have the national security strategy, which does the same thing. So they agreed. It was coincidence. We had no working with them. It was just a coincidence. So it's been the case for a long time. And now we're aware of it as a country. We're very aware of it. We see it graphically, and the media is very aware of it. And good. And the lesson of this is that you can't pull them apart very easily. That won't work. You're just going to have to change the circumstances that will make them realize that that kind of an approach is not going to work anymore. And that's what I think we're about. And certainly that's what Congress is about. And so I think nobody wants a war, but you got to be firm, and you've got to take this step.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So one is, what do you think about the allies like Germany, France, Canada, Australia? Do they have a similar view at this point? That's one. Second one is, given the supply chain issues since the pandemic changed our lives and the other potential threats that you outlined, do you think the big businesses in the US would be more interested in diversification in terms of where the goods are manufactured?
So, but to repeat your question, just for the people online, repeat your question. So, yeah. So one good question. So the gentleman here question has two parts. So the first part is, what are the U.S. allies' perspective, right, on this bilateral relationship, the current dynamic? And secondly, I guess it's more broadly in terms of U.S. businesses, response in part to China as well as to the pandemic in terms of diversifying its locations and production facilities and so forth.
Great. On the allies and partners, this is very different with different places. The U.S. Obviously came to this understanding in 2017 that China was an amazingly important danger to the United States. Did the others share that? They did that. In 2017, no, I don't think anybody shared that. Maybe Taiwan, but the others didn't share that at all. But that's changed. And there's nothing like Putin to help you in Europe. That really changed Europe. And that has changed. I don't think that's going to change back. I think that's very clear now. And so that the danger of Russia is so tangible to Europe, and China is seen as complicit in this. So I think that's a big change. And the Europeans now want to work in Asia. The British and the French have forces there, of course, and they work, and NATO wants to be more deeply involved in dealing with China. So this is this is real progress as far as you building up your allies and partners. In Asia, it's selective. And so Japan definitely feels this way. India now does feel this way. Australia definitely feels this way. All were much more indecisive in this earlier period, but now they do. And so they're the basis of what you have. But in Southeast Asia, who feels that way? Hardly anyone feels that way. They don't want to choose. And what they do, they're in a situation where they're just increasingly moving into China's orbit, and they won't acknowledge it. And yet, they won't take steps in the other direction because they'll be punished by China, and they know it. And they know that the Biden won't punish them. So it's much easier for them to do that. And so I think in Southeast Asia, the Chinese are winning in that sense. They really have the upper hand. But India, Japan, and Australia really count a lot. They're key elements in this. So it's a real contest in Asia, as you can see. In Europe, I think the Chinese have really lost ground. But that was fairly peripheral for China. What's really important for China is the rim of China. And China's doing pretty well there. It's mixed. It's a mixed picture. But China's doing a lot better than it was.
Tina Chong with Voice of America, China branch. Professor Sutter, you mentioned the role of Congress and its hardening on China, but I wonder on Congress' role with regard to Taiwan, we also saw a lot of legislations coming out. As a matter of fact, there is a group of delegation led by Senator Menendez visiting Taiwan just now. So I wonder if you can talk about Congress' role, in the policy toward China, administration policy toward China.
Well, for China or
Toward Taiwan.
Taiwan,
Sorry.
yeah. Congress very much likes Taiwan. So the Taiwan caucus is enormous in the House and the Senate, and so this is a given. Congress is always trying to do things in support of Taiwan, one way or another. Now it's much stronger because it's comes in the wake of a hardening of American policy toward China itself, which means that Congress therefore is even more active in doing this sort of thing, but it reinforces the administration. On Taiwan, several things have changed because of the change in U.S. policy. One thing that's changed is that China has put a lot more pressure on Taiwan because of Tsai Ing-wen's presidency. And the U.S. now sees that as trying to change the status quo. And so the U.S. says, we're going to change it back. And so that's the kind of thing that Congress does and the administration does. So that leads to a harder policy. Taiwan is a lot more important for the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. If you have a tough policy toward China and you might be confrontational, you're going to need Taiwan on your side. And it's right there in the middle on the first island chain. So you need that support. Third, Taiwan is very important in high technology industries. And if you're competing, if you give primacy to that competition with China, then that has a much higher profile as well. And then fourth, it's a way to, how the Chinese are advancing incrementally in the South China Sea. People say they're slicing the salami. Have you heard of that expression? Yeah. They slice the salami just little pieces at a time. Well, the Americans are sort of slicing the salami in reverse by saying, okay, you're doing that in the South China Sea. We're going to improve relations with Taiwan in a way that you're not going to like at all. And so it imposes costs on China. And it's a useful tool for that. And then just a couple of other points here. Since the relationship has been so disrupted, the main brake on doing things for Taiwan was that it would disrupt the relationship. You don't want to disrupt the relationship over Taiwan. Well, it's already well disrupted by all sorts of other things. So that's been overtaken by events. And so at the end of the day, what you find is that the thing that constrains the Americans on Taiwan is the danger of war with China. That remains. That's very serious, and that remains. But the other factors have all changed under the tougher policy toward China, which means that there's a lot more support for Taiwan. And the administration endorses this, and the Trump administration did, and the Biden administration does. So it's incremental. It's still within the one China policy, but it's a very different approach than Barack Obama, that's for sure.
Okay. I'm going to take one question here from online. And this is actually a student of mine. So, we talk about how China is tougher, more assertive, right? Both diplomatically as well as actually militarily in every respect. We know about the wolf warriors and those kind of things. But how much do you think, based on your analysis, are the Chinese bluffing, or do they really think they have the capacity now to really challenge us in all of these things?
I think it's a mixed picture. The Chinese are challenging us in a whole host of ways, as I tried to indicate in my talk. It's all very incremental. It's deniable in many respects. It's disguised in many respects. And it's piecemeal. It's iterative. And so nothing dramatic in that sense, nothing big. So they do that. what they very scrupulous though is to avoid is military conflict with the United States. If you look at how they treat countries like Australia, Japan, India, these are countries that are all doing things that China doesn't like. And what do they do to them? They beat them up in one way or another. They put a lot of pressure on them. They confront them all the time. Did they do that to the United States? Look at the record. Look at Donald Trump. Remember Pompeo? Secretary of State Pompeo? You don't remember him? Oh, okay. Anyway, he'll be back. Be careful. But the point is that they every other week they would insult China, fundamentally insult China. And what did China do? Well, Xi Jinping was in charge of dealing with Trump. That was his job. He went to Mar-a-Lago and he would deal with Trump all the time. And what did he do? Did he say, we're going to blast you if you do this? Never. Not even close. Never punished him. Why? You have to ask yourself why. And you look at the calculus, you say, it is not in China's interest to confront the United States militarily. It is not in their interest. It's very not in their interest. And with Trump, they didn't know what he would do. And with Biden, well, look, in the past, he looked soft before. He doesn't look so soft right now. So I think and the United States is just very different than what it was a few years ago, as far as these things are concerned. So they're very careful about that. So it's a mixed picture, you see what I mean?
Yeah, okay, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, okay. So I'm the business scholar from Chinese University. I'm new, so my name is Jenny. So my question is, I wonder why the US defines China as a hostile power. So is it because of like the different political system, different ideology, or is it because China is ruled by the Communist Party? So, or is there any way to build like a better or a more friendly relationship between the two states?
Go ahead.
I keep on forgetting this. This is
Fine.
this hybrid thing is very new to me. So for the people online, so I think the question here is why does the United States define China as a hostile power? I think more precisely, what are the factors that go into defining U.S. definition, so if that's the case, of China being a hostile power, and also going forward, is there any way to reverse that perspective?
Thanks for your question. I think there are some Americans who look at it from an ideological point of view. I think there are some Americans who look at it from a system point of view. There are racist Americans too, and that could be a factor as well for some. But I don't think that's that important. I think the real issue is China's behavior. Look at China's behavior, China's government behavior. What are they doing? I'm just talking about this episode with the island buying. What are they doing? And how are they manipulating the United States? How are they taking advantage of the poorest system in the West? What are they doing? And when you do that, you get really angry. You say, my God, because they say they're not doing it. The mendacity of China is amazing. It's a word I like to use because most people don't know what it means, but it's not very good. It really is amazing. It's not in the Chinese people's DNA to be expansionist. Xi Jinping says that repeatedly, and people in China say, "Yes, that's right." And we never interfere in other countries' internal affairs. We favor globalization, free markets and so forth. It's just amazing. We never bully. Xi Jinping said at the ASEAN summit, remember, we never bully these countries that they bully every day. You see what I mean? And so Americans look at that and they say, what the heck is this? They said this is not sincere. You see what I mean? And so it's behavior. this kind of behavior. And so what are they up to? That's the they being not the people of China, they being the government and the party structure of China. What are they up to? And this is, so it puts you on your guard completely. You say, wow, we were really misled by this sort of thing. You know, and if I could elaborate for a minute, I don't want to. In the first decade of the 21st century, the Chinese officials worked very hard to persuade the world that they would be a peaceful rising, that they would, and the process would involve constant reassurance of the United States. And this went on for a decade, you know, from 2002 to 2009, basically. And I had 45 minutes with a vice president of the party school in 2004. I asked him about this, and he went on at length. I only had one question. He took 45 minutes in fluent English. He just went through this thing, explaining why China did this. And I was one of hundreds of people who were doing research on this sort of thing. And so he said, my God, this is really amazing. That's what they're going to do. They're going to be reassuring us. And so I thought that back of the minds thing of that 1995, you know, we don't like your leadership in the world. We don't like your policy toward Taiwan, and we don't like you changing our political system. I guess they put that aside for the time being. You know, I guess they did for the time being, but it didn't last. They told us it would last. They told us it would go at least 2 decades. It didn't. So behavior and total, not total, but how can you trust a place like that? You know, I mean, it's just, how do you trust them? What are they up to? You're very suspicious. And I think right now the Congress is completely distrustful of China. And so the Chinese government. And because of this kind of behavior. We're not doing these things, we tell you we're not doing it, and everybody in China knows we don't do them, right? People that do very effective in doing that, making sure people in China agree with that. And yet they're doing it all the time. So that's, I'm sorry to go on like this, but this is, obviously it's affected me. So I think it's, I don't think I'm alone. I think a lot of people are.
So I know we're getting close to time, and I know I have several hands up here. Are you, how good are we on time? You know, we want to, we got a few counts, but let's go with, yeah. Right.
So my name is Nancy. I'm from Georgetown Foreign Service. So my question is a little bit about, I have read your Professor Sutter's like third edition about the book. So unfortunately, I haven't got time to go through the first edition, which I promise I will after this. And so my question is about like how, so from your book and from the previous conversation, it seems like it's hard to distinguish like Chinese state actions with like Chinese people's action right now. Like also it's how to differentiate like Chinese companies like actions with like Chinese parties action. So can we still like let business do the business right now, or every action right now is affiliated with some certain like national interests like by the government, no matter from the Chinese side or the US side? And how can the US-China policy recognize these distinguish?
So just repeat the question again. So I think the question is there any way to distinguish between US government or Chinese party state actions and behaviors, Chinese people's behaviors or attitudes, and Chinese business behaviors and attitudes? Is there any way that for us to make those distinctions, and how's that, if it's possible, how we could do that?
It's very hard to do when the Chinese party state system uses these people-to-people contacts for their own purposes. Very hard to do that. Wang Qi, Dr. Wang Qi, some of you may know him, the U.S. Policy Foundation. We worked together for decades at the Library of Congress. He has a long history with China. He has this foundation, and he has written an op-ed saying this is a very serious matter. He's right in the front, he's on the front lines in this sort of thing, trying to improve understanding between the United States and China. He's given his whole life to this. And he says, United Front Department of the party, things like that, undermine my efforts. And he's right. And I think that's, so how do you do it? I don't know. They can, if they, being the party state, if they can see it's in their interest to do these kinds of things, then what do you do from the American side? The credibility of, well, I'm just a person from China, you see, well, maybe you're not. And why do you feel that way? Because some of them aren't, if you see what I mean. And party members, of course, that's pervasive. It's a big party. You've got, what, 90 million people, party members in China. So, and if they have party discipline, which they're supposed to have, this can lead to this kind of situation. So I'm not optimistic about this one. I think it's because the party state is determined to do this. And they have a lot more money to do it. A lot more money. So it's so this is why this is coming up. This is happening all over the world, including the Solomon Islands. So it's something that we have to just be aware of. And I don't think it's an easy answer.
One more question.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a very bad moderator because obviously we're going to time, but that gentleman has his hands up for a long time. So I go ahead and get the last question.
I had a very quick question for you, and based on your experience and your overview, what kind of successor can we see happening in China? As we know, the present leader is not in the best of health, high blood pressure, heavy smoker, etc. So who can we expect to see him like?
The leader of China?
Yeah.
I'm not sure he has all those bad health habits, but he is. I think he's in pretty good shape. He looks okay to me, you know, and they take good care of him. They wouldn't let him out of China for 2 years because of COVID, and so they wouldn't let people meet with them for 2 years. So it's so I think, you know, I think he's going to be around for a long time. It's my assumption. He's supposed to get another term at the end of this year in the party Congress, and that's likely to happen. And so he'll break the mold. The mold was only 2 terms. Now he's going to have 3. And if he wants 4 and he's still powerful the way he is, then he'll get another term. So I think we should get used to him. I mean, I'm used to him, and I think we should, you know, understand that that's the way China's going to be. And so when I said that China won't compromise, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's going to be around for a long time.
Well, it's definitely a pleasure, and I think, you know, and I know a lot of people have a lot more questions both online and here in the audience. But you know, well, first of all, just want to thank very much for Professor Sutter for his.
Thank you.